Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Interpretation, Method and Critique seminar series. This is the second seminar in our series for this semester 1, 2023 on the Australian academic calendar. Before I introduce our speaker and myself, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we in Canberra are on the lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and note, of course, yet again, for those who were here previously, the importance of this year in Australia for issues associated with reconciliation and rights and recognition of Indigenous peoples in the context of the debate around the referendum to change the Constitution. I'm Nick Cheeseman, one of the co-conveners of the IMC, and I think this may be the first time it's happened. The other co-convener is here with me in the room, April Bickham, and we have some other friends and colleagues here as well. And today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Adele Webb, who is a research fellow in democracy and citizen engagement at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra, where she's involved with the Connecting to Parliament project and is also teaching in the Masters of Public Policy. Adele joined UC quite recently and is still presently not on the campus, which is why, Adele, you're not with us here in Canberra, but we're looking forward to meeting up with you again when you're down soon. Adele recently published a book called Chasing Freedom, the Philippines' Long Journey to Democratic Ambivalence, that was published with Liverpool University Press and the Ateneo de Manila University Press in 2022. And Adele, as you recall, I heard you speak about that book in our seminar series, our being my department here, Department of Political and Social Change at the ANU last year. And at the time you touched very briefly on the genealogical methods that you were using in doing that work. And I asked you questions about it. And so the invitation today is to come and speak more on exactly that topic. Hence your title, Genealogy as Method, Historicising Political Subjectivities and the Political Unconscious. We'll give you about half an hour and then hopefully have a good amount of time for the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Let me just share my screen before I start speaking. Okay, can everyone see that clearly? Yep. Okay, I'll assume you can. I once had a class of students that sat there in silence for 40 minutes while my screen didn't show and nobody told me, so I'm sort of traumatized by that experience. I'm assuming...
We can hear you clearly, thank you.
Yeah, good. Let me begin by thanking Nick and April for organising this seminar series and for the invitation to speak today. I also want to note the fact that the University of Canberra, at which I work, is located on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I want to pay my deep respects to them as a sovereign people and to the land of which they are the traditional custodians. But I'm speaking today from Brisbane, and that's the land of the Turrbal people. My 4-year-old twins are in the community kindergarten down the road learning the Wiradjuri language and starting each morning with a pledge to go with Yinjamara in their hearts. So I'm learning what it means to incorporate Indigenous knowledges through them, which I think is a wonderful thing. In today's seminar, I want to do two things. First, to explore in a little bit more detail what genealogy as method is, what it is not, and some of the things that are important to consider in our application of it. But second, I'll talk about, excuse me, my own experience of using genealogy as method. As Nick mentioned, I used it in the book that I just recently published. Before I start, a disclaimer of sorts. I don't by any stretch consider myself an expert on this method. So this is not so much an explication of all that there is to know about genealogy as method. For that, I recommend Colin Koopman's Genealogy as Critique book. It's a very good source, a very good resource. Rather, I want to think about some of the questions that I've tried to answer in my own research that lend themselves to this type of inquiry. And in particular, the aspects of knowledge construction of subjectivities, and the problematization of the present. And hopefully to help us to imagine how this type of historical and philosophical inquiry can be useful and perhaps defensible in a discipline as predominantly positivist and deductive as political science. Now, if you browse the titles of articles these days in various disciplines, ranging from education to health to politics, you're likely to see more than a few invocations of genealogy. A genealogy of this, a genealogy of that. But from my experience, if you were to look inside many of those articles, you would find little to no mention of genealogy as a method. So genealogy, it seems, has become a fashionable euphemism for studying something in historical context. But it's more than that. It is historical, yes, but it studies the past to find the origins of the present. So it descends, if you like, into the past in order to identify submerged processes of emergence. Drawn predominantly from the work of Michel Foucault, who was himself inspired by Nietzsche, genealogy is a grounded political methodology. It's an interpretive, analytical tool that can be applied across disciplines and in many and various lines of inquiry. And as a methodology, genealogy offers us acuities to displaced histories. It underscores contingency and it avoids assumptions of coherent and singular historical trajectories. So let me start a little bit upside down, so to speak, by addressing what genealogy is not. So genealogy is not tied to Foucault's concepts. So using genealogy as a method does not necessarily mean that one must invoke any of Foucault's big concepts like discipline, biopower, self-care, or even governmentality. We associate these things with Foucault's work, and yes, these concepts emerged out of his methodological ensemble, and we would, I think it's fair to say, seem to lose a grip on them if we detach them from the methods. But by contrast, the methods can travel without the concepts. So you can use the methods, the use of the methods, I should say, doesn't require us to invoke these specific concepts which Foucault himself were emerged for him through using the methods. And I think this is good news because it means that we can deploy the genealogy method for inquiries that Foucault didn't, wouldn't, or couldn't imagine. So indeed, Foucault did not write about imperialism. He didn't write about colonial power and post-colonialism. Yet colonial genealogies, as I'll talk about a bit later, have become some of the most insightful contributions to post-colonial studies. So second in the list of nots, genealogy is not a code for doing theory. So people sometimes talk of Foucault's theory of power, for example, but in fact, Foucault didn't have a theory of power. What he offered was not a theory of power, but ways of doing the patient and detailed analysis of how power works. And I think that's worth mentioning. The third thing is that the work of genealogy might be activist in the sense that it actively seeks to reveal things that might shake up the present, but it's not normative. So it's not about finding the truth. It's not about condemning or congratulating courses of action. And indeed, the intentionality of actors is not the concern of genealogy. So it's not why they did something or another, but how they conditioned it to be so. And fourth and the final thing is that genealogy as a method of inquiry is not like a formula. So it's or a set of steps that one must follow in order to complete the application of it. So there's no how to do genealogy manual, which in a presentation like this makes it a little bit tricky, but at the same time, this is one of the most exciting and empowering things, I think, about this set of tools. So what we have to work with is this kind of set of specific analyses that Foucault produced, which were about things like punishment or sexuality. And each one mobilizes this customized methodology that's designed to address a problem from a strategic angle of inquiry. And Foucault said himself, I would like my books to be a kind of toolbox which others can rummage through to find a tool they can use however they wish in their own area. And I'll talk more in a little bit about my own kind of customized methodology, if you like. So did I just skip one? So here we go. As I mentioned earlier, genealogy can be imagined through the metaphors of descent and emergence. So it's about diving deep into the past, but not for its own sake, as a historian would do, but in order to bring back to the surface insights into the contingent processes that explain the present. So genealogies are, in essence, critical histories of the present. They are intended to emphasize and expose contingencies. That is, they start with the present and they aim to trace the conditions of the emergence of the present. And in particular, they go in search of the web of determinants that make subjects, paying particular attention to the interactions between knowledge, power, and practices of subject formation and practices of the self. Got my slides in the wrong order, but I'll go up, that's all right. So it goes without saying that genealogy is against positivism. So it's against single narratives of history. Marx's dictum that the history of all existing society is the history of class struggles, or Hegel's the history of the world is nothing other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. Even Walter Benjamin, his imagined angel of history, who saw his history as one single catastrophe. In contrast, genealogy sees the present as only coherently understood through the lens of historical processes of change and conditions of possibility. I talked earlier about Foucault's methodological ensemble, in which we could include archaeology, genealogy, and problematization. It's probably worth taking a minute to say something about the relationships between these three. At the beginning of the 1970s, Foucault seemed to demote archaeology and his work on the archaeology of knowledge in favour of genealogy. But I don't think it's a case of throwing something out and replacing it with something new, because the ideas of excavation and digging are still central to genealogy. And what's more, both genealogy and archaeology have at their core the process of problematization. So in other words, I think it's right to consider these three ideas as an ensemble. We could argue that genealogy is the kind of box in which we put the tools of archaeology and problematization, but I don't think that we gain much from trying to distinguish them, at least not for the purposes of this seminar. I do think, however, it's worth spending a moment to clarify problematization, because its application at the application of genealogy as method in that process, problematization is very pivotal. So Foucault said himself, what I tried to do from the beginning was to analyze the process of problematization, which means how and why certain things, behaviors, phenomena, processes become a problem. So this concept of problematization has two dimensions. On the one hand, it's a verb. It's the act of problematizing, of denaturalizing, of opening up questions about something. But on the other hand, it's also the object of the critical inquiry. So Foucault said, I am studying the problematization of madness, crime, or sexuality. And a great kind of application, if you like, and illustration of this idea of problematization is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Carol Barchi's work in critical policy analysis, with the what's the problem represented to be framework. This has become, one of the kind of key frameworks in critical policy analysis. And the central question that is asked in this kind of 6-step process of policy analysis is, what is the problem representation in a particular policy, and how did it come to be so? So you problematize the problem representation. And this is particularly powerful, and has been particularly powerful in the critical analysis of Indigenous policy. So you consider how certain policies represent the agency of settler society versus the agency and the character of Indigenous populations. Drug and alcohol policy, so think about the addict and how that kind of identity plays out in policy language and structures, or welfare policy. So how did something like welfare dependence become a problem? So that framework in critical analysis, policy analysis, uses kind of genealogy, or it certainly uses the problematization. And it's not about judging actors. So it's not really about why a certain policy officer wrote a policy a particular way. It's trying to understand how things have come to be as they are in the present. But moving on, because I want to spend the majority of the time today talking about the kind of application of these ideas to a particular area of study. And when it comes to the studies of democracy, whether they be focused on democracy as a regime, the functioning of institutions, or on the individual and collective political attitudes and values of citizens, there is a need that's slowly becoming more recognised in political science, at least, for us to identify the processes of globalisation that have made and continue to shape the political outcomes and the collective agency and the expression of subjectivities that we find in the present. This is especially true in the case of mutative forms of democracy found in non-Western, mostly post-colonial states. And I say these are mutations of democracy as they are commonly analysed as deviations vis-a-vis the ideal typical model of liberal democracy that emerged and remains predominant in the Euro-American world. But for historically and critically minded scholars of democracy, there are questions that need to be answered about how a Eurocentric theory of democracy gained strength and legitimacy by setting itself off against a non-European, non-democratic other. And the proposition that the democratization experience of North America and Western Europe is the model which all other countries should emulate needs to be denaturalized. It's ahistorical, it's ethnocentric, and it propagates an implausible premise that change in one society will mirror that which occurred in a different society at a different time. And if we do look at history, we see that the biggest expansion of colonialism that occurred in the 19th century was accomplished with liberal democracy as handmaiden. Colonial subjects were defined by their primitiveness, and the exclusion of whole peoples from basic liberal rights was deemed legitimate by the science of evolutionary biology. This rationale not only legitimated but made imperative the expansion of the white man's burden. The lack of history that has accompanied the development of liberal democratic theory over the last half century has obscured these complicated roots in empire. Instead, it has enabled the reification of a global hierarchy of democratized versus democratizing countries as a natural state of affairs, while erasing the centrality to Western epistemology of the construction of a non-democratic other. Diving deep into these histories means looking for and resurfacing with evidence of the processes, the interactions between knowledge, power, and subject formation, by which this reality has emerged in the present. This includes examining how colonial discourses of difference and political inferiority were used to legitimate acts of violence and subjugation and imperial rule, but also what effects those colonial discourses of difference and inferiority continue to have on the colonized subjects, even after the physical presence of the colonizer has been removed. To what degree has the imperial gaze of Eurocentric epistemologies altered the non-Western others' perception of themselves? And if the principal work of genealogy is to make visible the web of determinants that make subjects, hinging on this explication of effects of historical processes on the construction and self-construction of human actors, then the genealogical method has a critical role to play in studying colonial histories. The colonial context was absent from the work of its two principal pioneers, Nietzsche and Foucault. But scholars like Laura Stoller have skillfully demonstrated the way that colonial genealogies draw attention to the question of what she calls imperial duress, a condition of constraint that manifests in insistent, often non-verbal deformations of personhood. Colonial genealogies also trace imperial effects in what she calls colonial entailment, those obscured, often intangible but lasting logics that tenaciously cling to contemporary problems, defying temporalities and even spatial boundaries, and manifesting in seemingly inexplicable acts or beliefs. Colonial entailments, Stoller conceptualized, are molten in form, adhering to underlying logics of governance, and fixing themselves to the less tangible emotional economies of humiliation, indignities, and resentments that manifest in bold acts of refusal to abide. Stoller's book is probably still one of my favorite pieces of work that exists, and needless to say, it was very influential in my own work in studying the legacy of US colonialism in contemporary Filipino imaginings of democracy. But before I say more about my own project, another very influential book that's worth including in this conversation was part of the constructivist turn in international relations. So in 1996, a while ago now, Roxanne Lynn Doty published Imperial Encounters, The Politics of Representation in North-South Relations. The book was path-breaking because it sought to reveal the constructed nature of a global hierarchy of democratic states, which conventional approaches continue to reify and take for granted. So in reframing the analytical lens for studying foreign policy from a why question to asking how a certain policy, action, or practice becomes possible, Doty's work opened up questions of how ideas and identities came to be considered as natural rather than as purposeful constructions. And fortuitously for me, the focus of Doty's book, an exemplar of the politics of representation, was the United States foreign policy toward the Philippines, both during the colonial period, which lasted from the beginning of the 20th century until the end of the Second World War, and continuing into independence. And central to her argument is the way the American colonial project produced knowledge about the Philippines and the Filipino native that was disseminated and put to use to justify US conquest, violence, and subsequent control. And that was then used to create a consensus for annexation and control of the Philippines that made that action not only possible and legitimate, but kind of a moral imperative. It was a moral imperative for the United States to invade the Philippines and take control of and take over from their autonomy. So in the time left, I want to talk a little bit about the way I operationalize genealogy as method in my book. And I have a picture there, and I'm not being vain, although it's probably flattering because it's 10 years ago and I've aged a lot. But it's important because it's a picture of me reading the newspaper the morning after the May national elections in the Philippines in 2010. I had been living in Manila for 2 months. By that time, I was volunteering with an organization that was doing work on good governance and anti-corruption sort of material. And I was lucky enough to become a member of an international election observation team. And I went down to Negros Island, one of the Negros Islands, which is in the middle of the Philippines. And I was in Bacolod City. And long story short, there's lots that could be told about that experience, but of observing kind of the election in a very small village outside of Bacolod City. But the things that I saw and heard and smelt and felt and sensed on that trip would really drive the rest of my research from then on. And it made it imperative that I understood the present through the history. So influenced by both Stoller and Doty, my project really became about understanding how the encounter at the turn of the 20th century between the United States and the Philippines by which at that time had just declared itself independent from 3 centuries of Spanish colonization, how that set in motion certain social logics and constructed subjectivities that helped to make sense of contemporary Filipino political attitudes and preferences. So when we talk about, customizing methodologies, my study really had three core methodological components that could, if you like, be mapped onto our idea of starting in the present, descending, and then only to emerge again with insights into the historical contingencies that make sense of the present. So those three methodologies were interpretive interviews, archive research, and discourse analysis. So I did interpretive interviews, although at least after last week's seminar with Fred Schaefer, I tried to do interpretive interviews. I didn't do them as well as he modelled it, but certainly open-ended questions about meaning that came from people's long, open, non-structured narratives. And what I found, to be quick about it, because I could spend a whole presentation just talking about what I found in the interviews, but I found an ambivalence about democracy. So that is, I define a simultaneous and sustained saying of yes and no to democracy. So it manifested in the interviews of my respondents in this sentiment that could be expressed something like, the best thing about democracy is that it assures freedom. The problem with democracy in the Philippines is that there's too much freedom. So this ambivalence really plays and has played and continues to play in the Philippines into the hands of authoritarian populists like Rodrigo Duterte, the former president. It's disparaged in the literature as either cognitive unsophistication in the ways of democracy, confusion, a predisposition to pre-modern forms of political culture, etc., etc., etc. But I wanted to ask questions about where this came from. This outcome, I thought it must be contingent on historical processes, especially given these kind of really important interactions between knowledge, power, and subject making that had happened in the Philippines over the 100 years or 120 years prior to this, to the present. So in terms of descent, starting from that kind of the present, I descended, if you like. In genealogy, as we said, it involves this historical investigation, but it's more than history. It's genealogical descent, to use someone else's words, involves looking through an ever-increasing spread of potential multiple influences, a ramshackle avalanche of events that owe much to chance and accident. This allows us, in Foucault's own words, to identify the accidents, the minute diversions, the false appraisals, the faulty calculations that gave birth to those things that continue to exist and have value for us. So for me, this meant going to the archives and looking for things that didn't necessarily fit with the conventional narrative or the big story, and looking for contingent processes that I could identify. And without going into too much detail, an example is I spent quite a lot of time in the book, 7 or 8 pages, talking about an event that, as far as I know, isn't written up anywhere else in the many and various history books on Philippine politics, at least not beyond a brief mention. So I found a record of the transcribed proceedings of a public hearing that was held in 1910 with the visiting US Secretary of War, Jacob Dickinson. And he was the most distinguished American official to have made the journey from San Francisco to Manila Bay. He spent 40 days in the new colony, and 2 days before his departure, he held a public hearing. And he offered an open invitation to hear from the public in attendance about matters affecting their interests, with an assurance that he'd come to the meeting, quote, for the purpose of listening to any representations which any of you gentlemen may desire to make. The morning's interventions that followed from members of the middle class did not change colonial policy or practice one bit. Nothing was taken up by the US Secretary. He was like Teflon. But what was interesting and surprising to me about this material was not only the fact that it gave me a chance to hear the rare voices of middle-class men who, according to the conventional narrative, were quickly and entirely co-opted by the Americans and lured into the colonial administration through the offer of education and jobs. But that when I did hear those voices, they were invoking democratic principles and notions of dignity to challenge the contradictions and anomalies that they saw around them. They were all speakers unwilling to concede to the defamation of Filipino subjectivity that was implicit in America's colonial project. And what was clear—
sorry, Adele, just to let you know that about 5 minutes, if we can get within that time.
Don't show me that clock, Nick. What was clear from the interaction from the US side was the practice of gaslighting. So much so that towards the conclusion, irritated as he was by one of the speakers, the Secretary of War says this. Then, because President Taft has announced the policy of preparing the Filipinos for self-government, and you think that you're now prepared for self-government, you think that the continuation of that policy on the part of President Taft indicates a purpose to colonize the Philippines, I think you had better wait until the American people do something to indicate that they have the intention of colonizing the Philippines. That was 10 years into the colonization of the Philippines. So one of the complexities of this period was that the way in which the middle classes, reared as they were under this intensive process of Americanization, began to imbibe the colonists' democratic discourse while never fully capitulating to the program's underlying tenets. So what it revealed is this kind of complicated way in which Filipinos practice living democratically within the colonial democracy paradox. It was less a case of inculcation of colonial rhetoric and more a story of recursion, of capturing the way that the middle class began to inhabit the colonial condition in an effort to eradicate it. So the next process, obviously, is this emergence. And emergence refers to this kind of analysis of the surfacing of events that otherwise might, and the surfacing of some events, whereas others might are dissipated or disappear. And one of the main ways that I did this was through discourse analysis. I followed Dottie's model of critical discourse analysis that she used. It's called the discursive practices approach. And the benefit of the process is that it really looks at speech acts for the way that things are described, assumptions in the text, and subject positioning. It's not concerned with the motivation of the speaker or the intention of the speaker. It's just trying to understand how certain representative practices are reproduced in the discourse. And I analysed text over 5 years in the Philippine Free Press, not to go into detail. That was the kind of main English weekly newspaper that had a lot of coverage on politics. And what came out of that was this clear dominant discourse where even post-independence, the Philippine voices continue to construct the subject of the United States and the Philippines in a way that represented the differential identities and the racialized distinctions that had appeared in the American account. So the United States was represented as benevolent, patient, divine. In its relationship to the Philippines, the United States was depicted with attributes such as trustworthiness, fairness, generosity, eagerness to help. And conversely, the Philippines was continually described in negative terms as sick, infested, disease, compromised agency, childlike, with infantile capacities and attributions like easily wooed, immature, foolish, fond. And the distinctions weren't just drawn between the kind of Filipino subject and the American subject, but also between the two different types of nation states. So that America was the good guy, world's guide, protector, and the Philippines was deficient in comparison, floating around this fixed signifier, but not grounded. So the naturalizing of this asymmetrical relationship between the United States and the Philippines continued to constrain Filipino imaginings of their own democratic agency, while at the same time enabling the United States to exercise a level of sovereignty over the islands, without needing to claim the status of sovereign power. So the language of gratitude and indebtedness made certain policies and practices in the independence era possible, even imperative, while it precluded others. And the deeper the political crisis that emerged in the Philippines during these early independence years, the more it seemed to reflect not only on the innately corrupt character of the Philippine politicians, but also on the foolishness of Filipino voters, a narrative that continued to reinforce the colonial construction of the inferior Filipino subject incapable of self-government. And to cut a long story short and to skip many pages, I argue in the book that these complex processes manifested as democratic ambivalence, a love-hate relationship to democracy. So it wasn't that the desire for genuine sovereignty and independence had diminished. It was that these aspirations remained coupled to a willingness to concede to the imposition of arbitrary authority. So in the pursuit of democratic aspirations, there was an acquiescing to imperial forms of governance, which included limiting space for participation and dissent. If you know anything about Philippine political history, what happens after this is the era of Ferdinand Marcos and the descent into dictatorship. And the book continues up until the present, or at least the present when I finished it, which was in the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. And I could spend much time explaining that argument, but the focus here is really on the method. And I will, Nick, don't worry, I'll finish there because I hopefully want to allow time for a discussion of things that I didn't specifically talk about, but which were there, which include the challenges presented by applying this sort of method to our work. And I certainly had some, and I'm sure there are other ways of going about doing what I did. So I'd love to hear from others about that.
Right, thank you so much. Good, so we will now have some time for questions. If you wouldn't mind, Adele, first please just closing your screen so that we can get those friends and colleagues online onto our screens as well. I'd like to recommend that anyone please just use the electronic hand raising function if you're online, and if you're in the room then a flesh and blood hand will work. I think a publicum is waving, so why don't you take it away as the camera is pointed in your direction, and then we'll watch out for other interventions. And just a note also, Amber, can you clarify which quote you're referring to in the chat? Do you want a source? So if you could indicate which quote that was, we can follow up with Adele. Thank you.
Thanks, Adele. I really enjoyed your talk. I don't mean my question or my comments to be in any way a criticism of the sort of richness of your analysis, but I do want to pick up on a methodological point, which is that I'm wondering if some of your metaphors and concepts actually sneak a positivist understanding of history back into your sort of research design, because like concepts like determinants or metaphors like deep dive, because of course the past only exists. We can't sort of reify it or ontologize it as a result of the practices of archiving that we may or may not be able to access in the present. So there's a lot of work right now on the fact that Britain had a practice of destroying its bureaucratic records upon departing different colonies. So what happens to be in the archive is there as a result of a variety of decisions that have been made sort of before us. So that's, so this idea that we can go in a deep dive to the past, right? We can't. We can go to the archives, and we're lucky with, with what we happen to find, and that's not going to be completely representative of everything that we could possibly analyze. And then, sorry, just two more other points. I completely agree with you. Obviously, this sort of analysis of race science and Britain in the 19th century, and there's so much work in IR now really drawing our attention to the impact of race science, not just for British colonization, but the fact that political science itself was founded as a science in this race science. But I'm wondering if you maybe need to think a little bit about your periodization there, because the American direct colonial period that you're talking about occurs in the 20th century, and many historians argue that that's the second phase of American empire, the first phase being the expansion westward into the continental United States. And the British Empire is at its largest when it takes over German colonial territories after World War I. So actually, this is a period of empire that you're talking about, but both British and American empire in the 20th century. So I'm just sort of wondering about your periodization there. And also just to recommend Julian Go's Patterns of Empire, if you haven't read it, it's a great book. Sorry. Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you, April. There are some excellent points, and I'm actually going to be cheeky and go back to you on the first one at least. So let me just answer the second two first, because I think they're more straightforward. So Julian Go, yes, excellent, very influential. I met him once before I'd even started, and he was very influential in kind of the pursuit of the study. Empire and the periodization, absolutely. And in the kind of longer reading, I guess, of the book, I talk about that, the conversation about kind of how liberal democracy emerged with, alongside of the expansion of imperialism, is just to say that's kind of when democracy emerged. But certainly that period of American empire in the first half of the 20th century is the period I deal with most in my work. And it's about kind of the way that they propagated kind of a vision of global order based on democracy that included, legitimization of benevolent imperialism in their terms. So absolutely take your point about the importance of that. And perhaps that was in my brevity that I made that seem more simple than it was. The kind of, thank you for pointing that out about the language like determinants. I mean, that's that quote about web of determinants is not my language. It's something I picked up from someone else, but you're right. And the diving as well. I think, I guess I completely agree with you. And I think we had this conversation, Nick, at the end of my last seminar when it was kind of a conversation, well, if this is meant to be a messy history and not coherent and so on, why have you, I don't think you said it this way, but the question I asked myself is, well, why did you write like a temporally ordered, like a chronological account then? And my answer to that question is, how else do we do it? Like, this is not a defense. This is a genuine kind of challenge. And I think when I talked about the challenges, this was my biggest challenge, because I tried very hard to try to think about how to organize the material in a way that wasn't like chronologically ordered, in the way that it could be taken as a single account. But I found that incredibly difficult to make it meaningful and translatable, I guess, the findings. So the best that I could come up with was to kind of have three parts in the book that talk about three different kind of emotions or conditions, if you like: democracy and conquest, democracy and duress, and democracy and ambivalence, and to kind of collect my material within those three parts. But I don't know if do you have a way around this kind of challenge?
No, sorry.
Well, I think that this is one of both the opportunities and challenges of genealogy as method, and surely Foucault does provide models, and the history of sexuality is in no way a chronological account of the history of sexuality. Whatever it is not that, right? And that sort of leads into some questions and thoughts I had around your presentation on sort of selection of data and organization of it. But then again, and I'll leave them to one side for the moment, Colin Koopman, who you referred to at the outset, has this new book out because finally he actually sort of put his genealogical money where his mouth is, as it were. Sorry for that metaphor. In as much as he came up with this text on how we became our data, and that, at least to the I've read about half of it, that is again more or less chronologically organized, right? So perhaps he struggled in the same way as you're suggesting, to think about an alternative that would allow the reader to appreciate what he was doing and why. Let me just note that, and then we'll go to Aheba. You may have to speak up, but Aheba Al-Adawi is at the other end of the table. So there we are.
Hi,
Please.
thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Well, thank you for this talk. And I think it's very liberating to know that there's no set of steps or manual to do genealogy. But I think as a student, it's also challenging because depending on your examiner, you might be vulnerable to the charge of not doing genealogy right. So I have maybe some advice with reference to what I'm trying to do in one of my chapters, which is not a book, but it's just a chapter. And it's trying to, again, denaturalize a concept by focusing on this notion of recursive analytics that Stoller talks about. So it's leading with that. So my question is, how important is it to foreground descent and emergence in your approach to genealogy, if you might be leading with some another approach, for instance, recursive reappearances, as Stoller talks about, and colonial logics that sort of reinscribe themselves.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have for an approach that maybe leads with recursive analytics at the expense of emergence and dissensions? That's the question.
Yeah, I think it sounds really interesting what you're doing, really fascinating, but also challenging. I don't think that, I think that, I didn't use the terms descent and emergence in my book. In a sense, it was a metaphor that was useful for this to serve the purposes of the presentation and kind of organizing kind of ideas here. So I don't think that in any way you need to be bound or are bound by that metaphor. For me, it helped to kind of make sense about what I'd done. And one of the things that I didn't really mention, but I had talked to Nick previously about this, and you might understand this, is that you don't, I certainly didn't, start the project and say, I'm going to write a genealogy. This is going to be like that. That came along the way. And I was trying to, that's what I was trying to convey, that the type of questions that you want to answer lend themselves to this work. And so you dive into this work, excuse the positivist, you read this work because you want to kind of go deeper into that sort of way of thinking, and that uncovering, work. So I think, there really is no one process. It's very iterative. I really think the ideas of recursion are really great. I loved that idea too, and I talked about that a lot in my book. So I don't think that answers your question, but I don't think I want to answer it, because I think that's your journey and your process. In terms of examiners and stuff, I mean, yeah, if they understand genealogy, then they shouldn't be holding you to account for sort of taking a set number of steps. Certainly, yeah, that wasn't the case for me, although I had Fred Schaefer as my examiner, and he was wonderful and generous and sympathetic. So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but
It's reassuring.
We'll need reassurances. Does anyone online have anything you'd like to jump in on? If you wanted to just unmute yourself and say so, then please do that. Otherwise, I'll look around the room for other questions or comments, or come in myself. Nobody? So let me take a couple of points that I have. So one that I just got from you, Adele, was that, right, this sort of way of associating descent and emergence with particular parts of the research that you were doing is something you thought about for the presentation. I was wondering if that was a little bit too neat. I suppose a skeptical position would be that, well, what in combination makes these three genealogical, or what makes that genealogy as methods, rather than just say mixed methods, right? We can talk about this in our usual conventions as being an example of interview data generation, maybe more or less interpretivist, historical archival research, and a discourse analysis or critical discourse analysis, a mixed methods approach, right? So whether or not there's something there that you may want to think through more, or if you have some preliminary thoughts on that. But the question I was really interested in, for also just thinking about the practice of doing a genealogical research, and in a way it goes back to what we were discussing a moment ago, was, as Heber again brought up a moment ago, of course, this isn't a stepwise process. So then what are the kinds of choices that someone who is using a genealogy as method has to make when they're in the archive? What kind of choices did you make? Were there, in a Foucauldian manner, sort of paradigmatic instances, perhaps the one you were alluding to in the presentation, that then your attention is drawn towards, and you try to offer an interpretation through a particular genealogical approach to that instance, privileging that instance over others? What other decisions did you have to make in the selection and organization of material that, again, you may say are distinguished genealogy as method from its others? Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, they're great questions too, Nick. So on the first point about kind of, the descent and emergence framework. So the thing that I really am struggling to kind of respond to, I guess, is that when I wrote and when I speak now, I have to be linear. I am constrained. So, but at the same time, when I did the research, it was not linear. So I was in the archives at the same time I was doing interviews, and at the same time I was beginning the discourse analysis. So all three happened at the same time and were co-producing each other, so to speak, or were co-determinant. So so that is one thing to say. The practicality of it is that it all happened at the same time. There was no going to the archives, then going into the discourse analysis and then interviewing, or doing the interviews and then knowing exactly where to go in the archives and so on. So I don't know how else to convey that other than to talk about it in a more in a linear way, because unless I did a kind of like a mind map, which in fact I did a lot of mind maps during the process, and perhaps that's why. But the other thing, that's a really good question about the archives, and I think there is no instruction manual for that. I think it is partly about doing all of these things at the same time, having a sense of what should stand out or could stand out, because in the end they're all choices that you make. Like I chose to look at some things and not others. They're choices also that are constrained by availability, and all of those things come into play. I'm not pretending to say that you have endless opportunities to find endless sources and you have to choose the right one. So, and I think I don't think it even matters, because I think it's just about identifying otherwise submerged pieces of history that have been ignored for a particular reason. And it could be the one that I like, so it could be the public hearing that I spent a bit of time focusing on, but it could have been something else. I don't think it had to be that. I just think it's about the nature of what it is and what it contributes to our understanding of how things, kind of the processes that were at work. And because these processes are of a nature that doesn't lead to, well, because of the nature of the processes, these are not things that are written about in our conventional histories. So I think if you have that in mind, you will find things in the archive, and any number of them might be suitable to use for the purposes.
Yeah, I wonder still whether or not if we had an historian present, they would be pressing you on, well, what then is really still the difference between that sort of archival inquiry and the work that they do. Of course, historians are looking for things that haven't been written about, documented and interpreted all the time, and become excited when they stumble upon something which offers another vantage point on history from those hitherto offered, and some,
Yeah,
of course, with particular
arguably they would be really interested in events, and so on. I was interested in subjects, so I was interested in any reference to the subjectivity, so reference to who the American was, or reference to who the Filipino was, and sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. That was basically what I was after.
Good. That's really important. And I think also perhaps problematization and problematizing as twin drivers, which you mentioned at the outset of the presentation, also something that if we had more time we could discuss. But again, I want to just offer, is there anyone online who would like to come in the last couple of minutes? Or if not, I have another question in the room, but I'll defer to the online community first. No, okay, Sam, over to you.
Thanks for your presentation. That was really exciting. I just had a straightforward methods question about the way you used Dottie's version of Dottie's model of critical discourse analysis. You said something like in her model, she's not too concerned with the motivation of the speakers, if I'm paraphrasing correctly. I wondered if you could expand on that. Yeah, when I've employed CDA or other like language-based approaches, I was kind of struggling with the fact that there is a context and the speaker wants to get something done, and how you can capture that and appropriately deal with it. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's a question of source. So for both Dottie in her work and for my work, you are not applying this and analyzing it over a range of sources. You have a type of source. So for her, she was analyzing colonial documents or kind of policy documents of the colonial administration in the case of the US. For me, I only apply this to this newspaper. So questions about context and so on are, I take what you're saying, can be important. And there were things that I pulled out that I used as in relation to the context in which they were said. But that said, the method itself is meant to allow you to identify a dominant discourse. So it shouldn't matter, the context in which something is said. You shouldn't have to make that connection every time. So and the reason why I was drawn to her work was, her process was not just, because of the subject matter that she looked at, was because she was one of the only people that actually told you, this is how I did it. And she did it in a journal article, not in her book. And she actually kind of like did quite a detailed explication of how she did it. And I was like, well, people keep talking about this thing, but nobody's telling me how to do it. I can look at it, but how do I look at it critically? Do I turn it upside down? Anyway, she has a process, and I followed her process. And it's really about extracting from the text three things in steps. So predicates, so descriptors from subjects. So for me, I had certain subjects that I wanted to extract descriptors about: Filipino or Philippines, America. I had a few others that I used that didn't kind of become integrated into the book, and then presuppositions. So you look at mention of things, and then you look at the assumptions around the text, and then subject positioning. So literally things, where invocations of a child and a parent, or sort of hierarchical relationships or imagery that's used in the text. And you extract all that into tables, and it just takes a long time, but it's very kind of systematic. And at the end, you put it all in a table and you have a look at it and you think there either is or there isn't a dominant kind of discourse here. And what I found was that it was clear, there was clearly a dominant discourse. So that sort of says, you can say that, but then you need to go into it and sort of, you know, talk more about what that discourse did in terms of the work that knowledge and those subjectivities did in terms of context. So in terms of, you know, what letting the Americans come back in and basically take over, killing all the bandits in the name of democracy and so on. So I talked about how these kind of identity construction and knowledge construction enabled, and in fact kind of encouraged those actions to take place. Does that make some?
Yeah, completely. That's a perfect answer. Thank you.
She's got an article which is the better one than the book in terms of the details of the method.
You may want to drop that into the chat, Adele. We are out of time, but actually there's been a back and forth in the chat about your sources. So before we conclude, we'll conclude the discussion now, but I'll leave the room open for another minute or two so you can go through the chat quickly and put some brief responses to people asking for sources there. And please add that article. Can I ask everyone to thank Adele Webb for giving our great presentation today? Thank you all very much. Thank you, Adele, for speaking to us. We have another 3 seminars in the series for our first semester that will be after our teaching break. So the next won't be until late April. So stay on the listserv to get details of that, or just look on the website to see the dates and speakers for the remaining presentations. And for those of you who are on the ANU campus or somewhere close enough by to be able to get here, a reminder that we have a social gathering this evening, 5 p.m. at Badger & Co. So I hope to see some of you there as well. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Adele. And as I said, I'll keep the chat open so you can take a look through and respond to those queries.